Yes, okay. All right. So, sorry everyone, if anyone's still on the air. We'll get right to it. If you got your Bibles, we'll do a bit of reading.
It's not yet.
Not up? Yep, it'll hopefully be up.
It might be up right now. Can you still say something that I can hear you?
No. Okay, so this is... Sorry?
You mentioned the movie for a minute.
Okay, you want to mention there's the picture if you...
We saw the most incredible movie last weekend. It's called Gosnell, and it's the story of America's biggest serial killer ever. And I think that everybody over 13 should see this. It's not a horror film, it's not gory, it's compelling, and it was made actually by an Irish husband and wife team who were not interested in the abortion question at all. But they were totally converted, as were all of the photographers and so on. And as a non-practicing, non-Christian, he said he wept at his computer over what he found. And so I just please want to encourage everyone to see this. It's a blessing to you, and it's a tool by which you can bless everybody else. So please see the movie Gosnell.
All right. Yes, we don't know how long it'll be out on theater. It's in limited release, so you have to look for it in your area. Really look for it. Okay, so we'll get right to it as usual. I'm trying to cover a huge topic here, but we've been doing the book of Galatians and Colossians with Anthony. And we have all been rather struck by the language Paul uses in reference to the Old Covenant law, known as the law of Moses or the Torah. So this is part of a new covenant series that I've been working on. And today we're going to look mainly at Matthew 5. So if you have your Bibles, and we'll read around the room. If anyone likes to read, we read one verse at a time. So we'll start with... Sorry?
Matthew 5?
Matthew 5? Yes, apologies for the tech issues as usual. I'm at my house, which is not a very good... Are they?
On yellow.
So Matthew 5, Tracy, you got it?
Yes, what verse?
17, and we'll read a couple of verses and we'll go around to Barbara and then 5:17, please.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
I assure you, until heaven and earth disappear, even the smallest detail of God's law will remain until its purpose is achieved.
Ready?
And else. Oh, that's what that is. Yeah. I read this a dozen times. Whoever then knows one of the least of these commandments, teachers others to do the same, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven.
Michelle?
For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven.
All right, we'll stop there. So I want to start there, and we'll work our way as time permits through the famous Sermon on the Mount here. But that section of Scripture, I think, has a lot of misconceptions through the Miscellaneous now, I guess. So the early battle within Christianity, which is a Jewish movement, right? Christianity came out in a way that sounded sometimes as he was challenging you to rethink that, if you were taught that, or if you currently believe that Jesus was a Torah, what they call a Torah observant Jew. Now, the reason this has been taught was because many people believe that if Jesus broke the law, he's a what? Lawbreaker. As we know it, as we Christians know it, most of Christianity doesn't believe in circumcision of the flesh, for example. After the resurrection of Jesus, only when the blood is shed, because the Bible's clear, right? Hebrews 9:22 says, in order for a covenant to be made, blood has to be shed. I want to argue that the new covenant actually begins ministry. Another misconception is of what we read, that the law of Moses was forever. And people usually who are Sabbatarians, Christians who are holding on to certain law of Moses things, like the Sabbath or food laws, they go to the passage there and say, well, look, he said not a jot, not a tittle, heaven and earth will pass away. But there it is. The law is not going to law that he says is forever. But there's an interesting contrast Jesus makes in Matthew. If you go to chapter 24, for example, verse 35, Jesus uses the verb and says, my words will not pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So I think even within his own life ministry, not post-resurrection, he's already supplanting. He's already, another word for supplanting, overriding, thank you, overriding what is written in his own Jewish law. So I also want to define what Jewish law actually is. So the law as, for example, Paul talks about the law having a, so he says that so we went through Colossians 2, right? Colossians 2, 16, 17. He says that the Sabbath, the new moons, the festivals are a shadow, and that the substance, the reality, now. That's how Paul is looking at his own law. He says, now some things in it have become a shadow. So that's Hebrews 10:1 as well. The Levitical system, you know, about the sacrifices, the temple, and so on. That has a shadow, says Hebrews 10:1. Another definition of Jewish law, a misconception, is that people say, well, Jesus didn't really break the Sabbath because he only does good things on the Sabbath. For example, he heals on the Sabbath. They eat on the Sabbath, Matthew 12, right? His apostles are picking grain. So it's nothing bad. Actually, Jesus says, I think in Matthew 12, he says, if you remember the scripture from memory, isn't the life of a human being worth more, right, than the Sabbath? That's, I think, Matthew 12:13. That's actually what Jesus says. He says, isn't your life worth more than breaking? But if you go to Numbers 15, and we'll look at that section, your life was not above the Sabbath. Because in Numbers 15, there's a guy picking sticks out in the wilderness, remember? And the Jews catch him working on the Sabbath. You know he's a lawbreaker, so what is the punishment? They're still not sure what to do. And then God himself says, kill him. And they killed the man, right there and then. So, can you see the huge contrast there?
Yes.
Now says, no, your life is not worth more than the Sabbath. That's a clear.
But for hundreds of years, they couldn't go grain on the Sabbath. They couldn't go, that was work, and they were not allowed to work on the Sabbath.
Right.
They weren't allowed to go gather food. They were supposed to get extra on Friday.
In the law. You follow? Is killed. Okay, so that's a misconception. The other thing is that we have to define in reference to what Jewish law is. Which law are we talking about? Now, not then. So now we have Old Testament, New Testament, right? The Bible is composed of two phases, if you will. So if you have an Old and New Testament, and we accept that as Christians, then the law of Moses. 1 Corinthians 9, it's clear, crystal clear. There's no problem with this, by the way. No corruptions, no variants, etc. Not yet. So Okay, but then Sabbatarians, people who are of, so in other words, you can't have two lords, right? You can't be under the law of Bob, and then I'm under the law of Barbara here, because, unless they agree on everything, then it should be the one law, but obviously you can't have two laws. Let's go back to Matthew 5. So I want to show you, like I just told you with the Sabbath, how Jesus methodically, in this chapter and other places, proves himself not to be a Torah by not only his teaching, his words, but his actions. So, Kay, I think was the last one. Can you read Matthew 5:21, and we'll go around the horn, please? 5:21.
You have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not commit murder," and whoever commits to the court.
But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever shall say to his brother, "Raka," shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever shall say, "You fool," shall be guilty enough to go into hell.
Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you,
Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering.
Tracy?
Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to and you may be thrown into prison.
26.
I say that you won't be free again until you have paid the last penny.
Now, can you jump, Betty, to verse 38, please?
You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth."
But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also.
If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also.
And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2.
Keep going. Misha?
42.
give to him who asks, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow.
43.
You have heard that it was said, you shall...
But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father, for he gives his sunlight.
And
Therefore,
40.
you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
So the category here under the law of Moses, Jesus, whenever Jesus says you have heard it said, usually goes back, sometimes, very rarely, I think, to except found sleeping with another man's wife. So God has allowed Israel capital punishment, okay, in certain situations. So that was adultery. I have an authority, a commandment to take your right out. So you got texts like Leviticus 24, Deuteronomy 19, the one who has inflicted the same injury. You must, again, interesting language here. It's always about purge the evil from among you. So if you don't do what God says, right? If I don't take Misha's eye out, there's an evil among us. And God could not stand that. Could not stand that.
Carlos, can I say something right here?
Yes, sir.
With regard to what we're covering, Matthew, you're covering some of my favorites. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. The thing that helped me more than anything, when I was so confused, we out of one of these groups, we were very familiar with all that stuff. We've done it all. We've tried to do it all anyway. For Matthew 5, when I said, but I say,
Yes.
you have heard, I say.
Right.
I need to be doing the I say. I don't need to be worried about what I've heard or read. The I say, and then there's in 1 Kings, I believe it is, 1 Kings, chapter 2, verse 3, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, keep his commandments, his ordinance, his testimony, according to what is written in the law of Moses. But in the law of Moses, you had Moses' commandment, which are also called the law of God. And way you get into this, see, is they say, well, the law of God is separate from the law of Moses. You go to Nehemiah 8, you find that interchangeably called back and forth when they're keeping the feast again. In one place it's called the law of Moses, the next time it's called the law of God. And that helped me more than anything to start coming out of that system. I was so confused. If you don't learn about the scriptures when you first converted,
Especially with Matthew 5:19, because Matthew 5:19 is whoever annuls any of these commandments and teaches others to do the same is, you know, be in the kingdom.
You're the least.
That's pretty powerful.
Well, I know we're the least in the kingdom.
What we're trying to do, we're trying to keep those things.
That's a great point that Bob makes. And in the NLT translation, those words, but I say, are 6 times.
Yeah, I say that they're what count.
Right.
And
Right,
it's
so-
my commandment,
Yeah.
not the law, in Moses' commandment. So it tells you what was in there, but it's awful easy, and you try to describe that and explain it to someone, especially like we were, with zero knowledge of the scriptures, and it's very difficult. Because
Right.
you just ask it. That's the first question: what's wrong with the 10 Commandments?
So I'll actually go back. I started at the end. Sometimes it's good to start with fulfillment.
Right.
So Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish, but fulfill.
That's another one.
Ends now. Exodus 22, verse 2. Listen to this one. If you happen to kill a burglar who breaks into your home, you're not guilty. So that's God, right? So you could kill the burglar. So Bob jumped ahead of us and says, but I say, right? But I say, so you have heard it in the synagogue, but I say to you. In John 7, the famous story about the adulterer woman, remember they catch her in the act. It's not hearsay. These people are saying, unless they're lying, argue that. But they catch this woman in the act, about to be good Torah observant Jews, right? What are they supposed to do? Kill her, purge the evil from among their people. But Jesus here says, basically, that mercy now overrides what the law said. Mercy.
Right there.
Sir?
You'll notice when he says, he upholds the law, doesn't he? He says, stone her. Pick up your rocks, guys, and stone her. But I'm going to add one little thing, I'm going to change one little thing. He is without sin gets to cast the first stone. And they all left. He called them right there. And that helped me too also to see that this thing is changing.
We have the famous eye for an eye, right?
Yeah, it's the same principle. It's the same principle people use to fight wars today. When you get to talking to people, and especially within politics, why we should fight this war or not fight this war, they always go back to that verse. Because I asked a friend of mine, I said, what did Jesus say to you? I said, what did he say to leave your enemy? He said, he got this befuddled because I said, what did Jesus say? I don't care what the general public said. I feel about this particular war or whatever. What did Jesus say? Love your enemies. Pray for your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That is difficult to do. Some of those verses, the most difficult scriptures in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 to live by. That's my favorite sections. Because I've read that over and over. I can't live up to this standard. But that's where we depend upon the grace of God.
Right. So, but there is no grace under the law of Moses.
Right.
If you're a Jew, and Jesus was a Jew, that's why I'm asking you to challenge yourself, challenge your pastors, that Jesus was a Torah observant Jew. A Torah observant Jew was told not to basically have mercy. Okay? He was told to kill the poor guy picking up sticks. Love of enemies. So clearly, right? Verses 38, 39, eye for an eye. But as Bobby said,
all the time, well, I would not let anyone do that. I only wouldn't want someone to kill my child. I would do what I could to protect them. But are you willing to give up that child in obedience to what Jesus said, especially knowing that they'll be resurrected? Death isn't the end. I think we fear death too much. That the resurrection is what we have hope in.
I'll do the same way though. If someone's trying to hurt my family, I will try to hurt them back. I'm not in favor of killing them all. But if I can tackle them or beat them off, which I couldn't, somehow or another, this question used to come up in the church we were in. To what degree can you defend yourself as a Christian? It's hard. Each person has to answer that on their own.
Well, love doesn't.
First, so we have to somehow harmonize our behavior, our mindset, and our arguments or justifications with the words of Jesus. So Jesus in Luke 6, information about this. He says, I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. 6:28, bless. Don't curse. You see how Jesus is going above and beyond what the law says, what the law of Moses said, cheek and so on. So now we have to not only try not to pay evil for it. By the way, so we're trying here. We're not saying we're perfect. Bob's not saying when it comes down to it, I'm going to do what Jesus said, but we have his words in our head in order for it to control our behavior if the time, God permit, comes, right? So now we have pray for those who strike you. Jesus then obviously would rebuke a weapon of war like the sword, right? Matthew 26:52. Peter, put down the sword. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. One of the church fathers, by the way, the church fathers who most of us biblical Unitarians always admonish or criticize, but they were nonviolent people. Even up to Nicaea, one of them, I think Tertullian said, when Jesus rebuked the sword with Peter, he disarmed all Christians. That's a beautiful line from one of the church fathers. Instead, look at this in Revelation 13. I'll get to the comments in a second. In Revelation 13, verse 10, if anyone is to be taken captive, into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they'll be killed. This calls for endurance and faithfulness from the saints. Again, Jesus is not saying here, defend yourself equally in proportional force. No, some of us, unfortunately, and this is talking about when you think it's bad now, it's going to get worse. He doesn't allow for proportional force. The old law of proportional force is no more. Did we have comments?
There's not a whole lot on that. They're just, God gave the laws to reveal his standard of absolute righteousness. Tracy had a comment before that. God came, that the Sabbath is a shadow. The perfect Sabbath, true Sabbath rest is the kingdom to come. There will be no sin, there will be love, and all will know the one true God. From Tracy. And then Joseph says, God gave the laws to reveal his standard of absolute righteousness. And I said that he wanted a people who were different and pure and above the heathens of those days. And that's one reason for the law. I mean, one of several reasons that he gave the laws. He wanted and people that stood out from the heathens that were, putting their babies to death and all that.
A stop sign.
Carlos, I was going to say that Jesus carried out perfectly his own commandments.
Yes, that's right. His own law.
Yep.
But not the law of Moses. Yeah.
And he and we will see that, right? It wasn't just because I'm Jesus, because I'm but he expected the same from his followers who were Jews. So we'll get to the story in Matthew 12 where his followers are breaking the Sabbath, right? And they come to him and say, hey, Jesus is not breaking the Sabbath in that story, by the way. They come to Jesus and say, as if Jesus is going to, criticize them.
The point about there being no grace or mercy under the law of Moses is eye-opening, because
Moses will be in the kingdom, obviously, although he couldn't get into the land. That's another story. But Jesus, the Messiah, let's just look at the Messiah figure. Was he Moses redux, Moses renewed, right? So let's move ahead here since time
Just
is.
a second, Michelle Ingram wrote a good comment I think you should share.
Who?
Okay.
Language, please.
Yes, Ingrid says, well, Tracy said Jesus set the bar higher. We have even a higher standard than the law.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ingrid said, yes, it is a higher standard to live words, but when it gets real in your life, it can be really hard.
Yeah, you know, it's really offensive to me anyway, I don't know to you, but when Sabbatarians say that we're lawless, you know, we're like, it's even hard, it's harder, way harder to be Jesus-like than to be Moses-like. You know, if you're Moses-like Barbara repeated, there was no mercy. It's easier to kill, I think. If you do harm to me, it's easier for me to kill you, I think. But if you do harm to me, do you think it's easier for me to stop myself from not doing anything to you and blessing you instead? Is that easier?
Well, part of the law had all those sacrifices. Now that had to be hard. You're constantly killing animals and taking them to, to pay your penance, and that had to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a burdensome to it. That's why the law of love frees us from all that.
Well, that's what Joseph just commented too, that Jesus told the two greatest commandments, to love God, know He's one, and to love your neighbor. I mean, if you're doing all that, you're not going to be killing them or...
All the long hail.
Yes, exactly. You're fulfilling the law. You're not going to steal if you're loving.
So let's go to divorce, the divorce certificate. So who becomes displeasing to him. That's all it says. If my wife displeases me, I can seek a divorce. So Jesus says to divorce, yes, it's true. The law says you had a certificate of divorce because of your stubbornness, of your hard-heartedness, right? So they test Jesus with that. They're testing him about it now over the commandment given by Moses. And then other laws. You still there, Michelle? Verses 33 to 37.
And you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. No, anything beyond these is of evil. Is that how far you said to read?
Yeah, evil. I mean, think about that. Now, let's read the law of Moses. Exodus 22 and Numbers 30. If anyone gives an animal to their neighbor for safekeeping and the animal dies or is injured or taken away while no one is looking, a woman could make a vow to the Lord, bind herself to a pledge in her parents' home. So that's the law of Moses. But Jesus says, don't swear at all. Don't make oaths at all. But shall fulfill your... But I say to you, do not swear at all. So was that a Torah observant Jew? That's not even Torah observance. That's clearly breaking Torah. In Matthew 6, let's see, who can... Tracy, can you go to Matthew 6, the next chapter there, please? Verses 16 to 18. The law about fasting. Look at this one. Matthew 6, 16 to 18, please.
Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their
fasting. So Jesus is for fasting, right? We can fast. But look at this. So he's in line there, we might say, with the law of Moses. So the law of Moses, that on the Day of Atonement, there was a fast. You should not eat on the Day of Atonement. So that's Leviticus 16, Numbers 19. So there was a fast in the Torah, in the law of Moses. But now I say to you, says Jesus. So Jesus does allow for, if you want to fast, fast. But then, in Mark 2 and Matthew 9, there's an interesting passage. The followers of John said, can you read that, Sarah, please?
We and the Pharisees fast often, but your followers don't ever fast. Why? Jesus answered, at a wedding the friends of the bridegroom are not sad while he was with them. They cannot fast then. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then never pour new wine into...
During the year, but I bet you they fast on the Day of Atonement. Because that was that was a holy day. That was the thing to
Right.
do. You would fast on it.
Yeah.
If you were an observant,
Mhm.
you were Israelite or
Right.
something or
Right.
whatever, but I would beg to think that they probably still fast on
Okay.
the Day of Atonement. I don't think he's talking about the Day of Atonement here. That's not what this is talking about.
Okay, well,
Right.
that,
None of
something
it
I
matters
experienced,
on this
which
thing.
I think was the right attitude anyway. We had an individual that had severe question. The whole congregation fasted for that person.
Yeah, we did that as a church all the time.
right.
Yeah, I mean, we would do it
For
worldwide
various
sometimes, but this was
issues.
just an individual
But that was
congregation.
different
So
than
we'll
the
do
Day of
this.
Atonement.
We love the man so much,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right, but don't get me wrong.
I'm sure I'm not saying it was correct. I'm saying the willingness, the love
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
to try to reach out and through God to help this individual to ask for supernatural intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Supplication.
Right, but during Jesus' ministry, he clearly says here,
Well, it's not a requirement, no.
at a wedding, the friends of the bridegroom are not sad while he's with them. They cannot fast then. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then, the question, I'll just put it out as a question, old wineskins. So, either his followers are not fasting at all, as this story suggests, during his time here, and after he dies, they obviously go. Or he's also maybe alluding to a change of fasting. In other words, you don't have to fast on the Day of Atonement. You can fast whenever you want to fast, whenever you want to pray for someone or whatever. It's not now under the of the law of Moses, which one time to fast during the Day of Atonement. I'll just leave that as a question for you. But that's an interesting story. The Sabbath. So let's move with Matthew 12. Whoever gets to Matthew, because this is a big story, can you read from verses 1 to verse 14? It's a race for Matthew 12.
I'm there.
All right. Go ahead.
Who can see the best?
First 14 verses, please. Loud
You
voice.
reading or you want me to?
I can. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off heads of wheat and eating the grain. Some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Your disciples shouldn't be doing that. It's against the law to work by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Then Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures what King David did when he and his were hungry? There's one here who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned those who aren't guilty if you knew the meaning of the scripture. I want you to be merciful. I don't want your sacrifices. For I, the Son of Man, am master, even to the synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand."
Okay, we'll stop there. So, again, Jesus goes to the mercy portion of it. But remember, again, I'll read again from Numbers 15. It's a quite striking story here. Actually, do you have it there, Sarah?
While the Israelites were in the desert, some of them saw a man gathering firewood on the Sabbath day. The people who saw him gathering the wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole community of Israel. They guarded the man carefully because they did not know how they Moses.
So again, when Sabbatarians say to me in debate, in dialogue, well, look, Jesus healed his own. They broke the Sabbath themselves. Oh, actually, they wouldn't say that. They say they were hungry, so they could eat on the Sabbath. But there's a guy picking up sticks. Once again, let's go back to the law. What did the law say? Jesus always goes back to the law. You have heard it said. But this is clearly a situation. Okay, you could say, well, were they dying of hunger, his apostles, his followers? Well, the text doesn't say that, but let's say that was the case. Well, was the guy dying of cold or of picking up the sticks? In other words, the bar again is raised. When the bar is raised, some laws, there's no doubt about it. When Jesus was on the earth, he says certain things that raises the bar, the old bar, and in doing so, certain laws, again, certain laws, let me be clear, that's what we just recited. So in this story, so Jesus said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, right? And in the story in Matthew 12, he makes us lords of the Sabbath as well. Can you read that section again there? Matthew 12, please. You got it on your slide, Sarah?
Yeah, it's 2, 4, 6, and 8. The Pharisees, the followers, are doing something that is against the law to do on the Sabbath day. Jesus said David went into God's house. He and those with him ate the bread that was offered to God. It was against the law for David or those with him. Only the priests were allowed to eat it. I tell you that there is something here that is greater than the temple. The Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath day.
I mean, can you imagine as a Torah observant Jew yourself, hearing a guy say,
Paul was saying that, maybe they did observe it, maybe they didn't. It doesn't really say from saying that they weren't fasting, but Joseph said in 1 Corinthians 9:20, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring, this is Paul, but to bring the Jews to Christ. Yeah, this is Paul, but I was with those who follow the Jewish law. I too lived under the law, even though I am not subject to the law. I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. And, like Michelle's point, well, he could have done that. The verse doesn't seem to say that. Does it really, matter?
It doesn't seem to say what? About fasting?
Right. But, like Paul's saying here, Paul would have, fasted. And, maybe Jesus was, because they were following certain things, like the Day of Atonement, you said.
Right. But it's to me, it's a totally different circumstance.
Yeah, because to me, Paul's a little
Paul
bit
is
way later.
a minister.
True. Jesus is really introducing this concept.
Paul is following it out.
Paul's already heard the concept, but Jesus is introducing this all.
And Paul didn't need to function circumstances. With the vow he took after conversion, he fulfilled that vow. He thought he was a Christian, but he fulfills that vow.
Right. Well,
he seems to go, I'm not saying he's acting two ways, but he's trying to get to people. If I have to go keep the Sabbath, these people, I will.
But not because he has to do it.
Right. Yeah, not that you have to do it, but he's trying to reach people.
Right.
Like, you're willing to bend a little bit to get your foot in the door. I just say that back that way. But that's really what it takes sometimes.
yeah, that's a separate issue to Jesus here.
Jesus is just introducing this.
He's introducing, you see it's changing.
But Jesus here about fasting clearly says that they're not fasting.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not fasting. Well, I'm here, they're not fasting.
Right, they don't need to. The bride.
But people fasted for a lot of reasons. I was just thinking that it's different than the Day of Atonement. I bet you they fasted on the Day of Atonement.
And they could have been.
Okay.
From these verses, it seems
they
like
would have.
they
Until
probably
Jesus told them
did.
they didn't need to, they would have.
Let's quickly go.
Afterward, after the law, because
About breaking the Sabbath by healing, by doing something good. But remember, we just saw that under the law, Numbers 15, mercy does not override the Sabbath. Your life does not override the Sabbath. Clearly.
Can I just make one
Yeah.
before you start with this? And that is, the man was not just picking sticks that were laying around in his driveway. He was gathering wood, which is work.
Work. Right.
You're not allowed to do work.
He's healing now, okay, and thus breaking the Sabbath. And then it says in verse 16, the reason the Jews were persecuting Jesus is because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But what does Jesus say in verse 17? My Father king until now, I myself am. For this reason, says John, now this is the writer of John, for this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not breaking the Sabbath, really? No, because he was breaking. And then verse 19. In case you don't have questions about whether he was a Torah observant Jew, but I have questions.
The NLT reads, in addition to disobeying the Sabbath rules.
Right. But the thing that they don't see, we don't see, is that we're dealing with the Messiah, the new Moses. He's the new, and a Torah observant Jew. With 17 to me huge. So the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Can you read that quote there, Sarah, please?
The saying of Jesus stresses the constancy of the divine work, which is not affected even by the... But Jesus then continues that he claims that divine authority is given to him as the Son, and hence that his work cannot...
So if he's breaking the Sabbath, if his followers are breaking the Sabbath, and we don't admit that, and he's breaking a whole other bunch of laws, law of Moses stuff.
He could have said when he was asked what's the greatest law, the commandment, he could have said they all are.
Right.
Well, he chose one of them now.
So I just passed the handout here in the block there, the notes, but I'll just go through what I call miscellaneous laws in your handout there about family. Look at this. The law says honor your father and mother, right? Honor your parents. But Jesus says to the guy who is, this is the funeral of his father, right? Lord, I will follow you too. This is Matthew 8. But let me go and bury my father, right? You must honor your parent. This guy's trying to honor the parent by burying him. Remember what Jesus said? Follow me. Let those who are dead bury themselves. Bury themselves. Luke 14. If you come to me, but you will not be, you cannot be my follower. You must love me more than your father or mother. You see how you got to think about this. Wait, the law says honor, even atheists or whatever, right? Non-religious people, honor your parents. But Jesus says, no, you honor me. Remember the famous story when, hey, Jesus, your masters are... Remember a little bit unfeeling that Jesus comes across as? But he says, my family's here. I'll give you that to think about. Another miscellaneous law there in your notes. Clean and unclean. Food laws, right? 9, and women with blood flow issues or menstrual problems, etc., they're unclean. Leviticus 15. All those things Jesus broke. He had to touch the sick. He had to touch the dead. He obviously said all foods are clean, Mark 7:19. I'm just running through this. The temple tax. I didn't know this story until I researched this. There was a temple tax in Exodus 30. Each man 20 or older who's counted must pay an offering to God. Right? That's a temple tax. Can you read that story there of Matthew 17, Sarah, please?
Matthew 17:25. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect taxes? From their sons or from strangers?
That sounds like Paul in 1 Corinthians 9. Sorry, not 1 Corinthians 9, but when, for example, he circumcises Timothy, right? Why did he circumcise Timothy? Because Paul was preaching circumcision? Look at Jesus. He sounds very much like him, doesn't he? He says, so we don't offend them, do that. But look at that. The sons are free. The temple tax is no more for them. I didn't know that one. We good? Is the streaming working?
Yes.
I hope.
Diane, come on.
So let's quickly go back to the fulfilled. So let's go back to the end. We'll go to the beginning. To the, sorry?
Christian Geigerman says this conversation is very interesting to me because as a former W, I was always taught that Jesus was Torah observant right up until his death.
Not only you, but everyone.
That argument has a lot of holes in it, as I understand.
Hey, thank you, Christian. I just want you to think about, I don't want you to agree with the pastor. By the way, we don't have to agree with the pastor. Have you thought of that? You don't have to agree with the sermonizer.
We don't have to.
Yes. You don't have to. You think for yourselves. You got
Be
Will.
listening.
Will
Be careful
got,
how you listen.
Will got brains.
I'm listening.
Exactly. Analyze, correct me, etc.
Etienne says Jesus was a Torah transformer.
And Hebrews is my favorite, another favorite book because it shows this happening. This law is gradually, first covenant is gradually, it's decaying, it's gradually fading away. Yeah.
Yep.
And let's look at the practical side though. You're a little Jewish kid and you're brought up in this.
As Jesus was.
Sabbath, blah, blah, all
Yep.
this.
As
Born
Jesus
under the
was.
law.
You know Jesus kept all that as a kid.
Yeah, right.
Kept every bit of it.
So here comes this person says, hey, you have to worry about this thing. You for 20 years or 25 years, this man comes along and says, no, we're changing some of that. That's difficult.
Yes.
And that's why I think Hebrews says it would decay or would fade away.
Hebrews 8.
Yeah,
Hebrews.
time. I think
Right.
God gave you time to kind of readjust their thinking because Peter, was it Peter, James, and Peter, John, and who were three of them went to the temple at the time of prayer. What was that? Three of them, Peter, James, and John.
I think so.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Thanks.
they're Christians, but they're going to the temple at the hour of prayer after conversion. Everybody's different level.
So let's go back to the beginning, which is now the end, as I wrap this up, to the fulfillment. So what does this mean when he said, I didn't come to abolish it, after the evidence I just presented and you have in your hands, and you can go and look it up, but so after all this, well, Jesus said he would say a Jew. Matthew 11 is a good starting point to think what this saying, I did not come to abolish but to fulfill, might mean. So this is when the baptizer is in prison, right? Matthew 11. Are you there, Tracy? If you, okay, Matthew is reading. When Jesus...
John, what you hear and see. The blind receive sight and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me. As these men were going away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John.
Till 14, please.
Okay. What did you go out into the reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing men take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come.
So I'll suggest you look at it this way. The Baptist was the last prophet of Torah. So Luke 6, Anthony has brought up, the law and the prophets were up to the Baptist. So up to him, he's the old way, he's the old law. He's not preaching new covenant, the baptizer. Jesus is the end of Torah then. Messiah then has to be the end of that system. It has to be. That's Romans 10:4. Paul seems to have understood that finally. So then Paul can say, like Tracy read in 1 Corinthians 9, I'm not under the Moses law. I'm under the Messiah law. And this is because Jesus is the redux, is the renewed Moses, right? And just like the law and the prophets, the rabbis foresaw this change. Many Christians don't know this. That's why we have to do our rabbinical before you get there. Can you read that quote, Barbara? From
will dine of the evidently non-kosher Leviathan.
Can you read, Tracy, the following two quotes there? Are you
Yeah. So is that
under Thompson?
Okay.
So these are two rabbinical works that we're citing here.
The rabbis taught that the mitzvah will
The commandments, the mitzvot. Yep.
Where do you, am I reading?
Yeah, that one. I'm just translating the Hebrew. The mitzvot is the commandments.
Oh, okay. Will be nullified in the age to come. And Rabbi Yochanan expounded,
John.
what does it mean, freedom among the dead? When a man dies, he is free from the commandments.
The next one, please.
The Eternal sits and examines the new Torah, which will be bestowed in the future through the Messiah.
So there was this rabbinic understanding, the Pharisaic understanding, that the Messiah would either, there are various views, would either change it, would either change it completely or revise it. You want to do something?
Well, Misha and I are listening to a book on tape that we drive. It's the Auschwitz Escape. And the one man, there are two Jewish men, and one of them was the son of a rabbi. And he was sharing thoughts about his dad. And this was, again, so it was before that Israel became a nation as it is now. Mm-hmm. And they were discussing it. And he said his father always got upset with all the Zionists. He thought, they're going to go to Jerusalem and they're going to, be a state. And they think that's what it is. And he says, my father said every Jewish rabbi knows only when the Messiah is going to be there, is there going to be, the actual state. And he went on with that. And I thought, amen to that. We don't think of that and hear that. You hear so many Christians today, build your kingdom now, a song they sing all the time. We're not kingdom citizens as, Jesus does. But his actual kingdom is not here, and we're not going to be the ones to build it, because that was the point that the Jewish boy was making, the son of the rabbi, was people think they're the ones who are going to bring about the kingdom, but not only until the Messiah comes is that kingdom going to even begin.
Right. Just to add to that, which is good to bring up about the kingdom now thing. Kingdom is now in one way, but not in another way. It's now in the way of the law, the new law. We're supposed to live as kingdom people now with the Messianic age law now. See, the thing is that for the Jew, for practicing rabbis today, right, they're still under the old law, because the new law can only be lived when the Messiah is actually here. But the change, one of the changes was that it's here spiritually, right? It's here, so the kingdom is here now in a spiritual sense, but obviously it has an ultimate physical, real fulfillment in the future. But we're supposed to live under the law of Messiah now. Rabbis still to this day don't see it that way. He has to physically be here. Just to summarize, and then if anyone has comments. So again, it's very important that the laws, look at it this way. The Baptist represents the last prophet of the Torah. Luke 16:16 is very key. It should be in your notes. Then let's look at fulfillment then. As Bob was alluding to, that the first covenant is obsolete. What's another word for obsolete? Done away with. Quashed. But then, as Paul alluded to, the writer goes on to say, it's fading out. It's vanishing. So it's been gone. It's gone. It's been squashed. But it's on, right, as we would say today. So look at it, fulfillment in that way. I didn't come to abolish it, but it's on its way out because of the things saying and doing, says Jesus. The cross is, of course, of utmost importance for, obviously, the resurrection. But when it comes to this topic, that's the focus point of the apostolic age, let's call it, the cross. Right, so you got Ephesians, Paul says, the decrees, the dogmas, right, they were nailed on the cross. Jesus took all that in his body physically and exposed it. And then the already not yet principle, as we, we're good? Oh, sorry, Bob, I can't see you because the camera's...
But if anyone's struggling with this issue, I don't know who you're preaching to, say, Sabbath, law, Moses, etc., etc. Acts 15, read over and over and over. This was the debate at this first church council. Should we teach new converts to keep the law of Moses? And you read it.
Right.
They gathered together, church elders, apostles,
guided by the Holy Spirit.
Guided by the Holy Spirit. It seemed good to us and the Holy Spirit.
Right. So yeah, can you put that,
Acts 15,
I wasn't
chapter
gonna-
15, if
right.
you're struggling with this issue, that helped me a lot.
So,
I've been there and done it, as I say, and it's tough.
So
It's
we got
hard to give up on that stuff.
we got a slide here, Bob, Apostolic churches for our viewers. So the Jerusalem Council, yes, of utmost importance. That was the subject. That was the cause I'm trying my French. Torah has become a yoke in that chapter. There's no circumcision. Remember, it's the entrance to Torah. You're not into circumcision of the flesh. You're just bypassing the door there. So if you want to keep food law, Sabbath, but are you practicing circumcision of the flesh? That's why that was the question, as Bob alluded to in Acts 15. Shouldn't we circumcise the Gentiles, they say, the Jewish Christians, by the way, so they can keep the law of Moses? You see that? You can't just go to the law of Moses without circumcision. Very fundamental. And then I got in the slide there, new creation, new person, as Bob alluded to earlier. The new covenant as obsolete, that was Hebrews 8:13, by the way, it should be in your notes. And then you just go down the list with the food laws in Paul and so on, and the Jewish calendar. So, Sarah, just to finish up, can you read that? I got a bit of a long quote here, but just to summarize, Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, please. It's in your notes there, folks.
Jesus, living in the overlap between the Old Covenant and the New, is generally obedient to the Mosaic Law, but at the same time he makes clear that he has sovereign rights both to interpret and to set aside that law. It is not, however, that Jesus consistently flaunts the traditions, for he attends the synagogue on the Sabbath and displays habits at mealtime and at prayer that are consistent with the traditions. What we have then is a Jesus who does not go out of his way to break the traditions of his day, but at the same time makes clear that he considers himself free to ignore them if need demands.
What is he?
What is impressive in Jesus' teaching is the way in which he taught directly and without reference to any other authority what it was that God was demanding of his people. The Mosaic law, if not discarded, is generally ignored, and this signals an important shift from both the Old Testament and the Judaism of Jesus' day.
And for more information, you got the book by Anthony Buzzard, who was himself a Sabbatarian in the Armstrong Church of, what was it called? Worldwide Church, I always forget. Worldwide Church of God. He was in there for more than a decade. And I hope, yes, you can continue, and we can continue the dialogue. It's all about dialogue and debate. So the law, the Sabbath, and New Covenant Christianity. Boy, that was a big topic to try and cover in an hour or so.
Thank you, Carla.
Yeah.
Very good.
Any
We do have
comments?
someone who's
time?
kind of struggling,
Yeah, sure.
that thinks she may have been possibly taught incorrectly, but she's not sure. She wasn't sure. I'm going to read everything as well, but one of her points was gathering the grain. Was that
Picking the
really
grain.
was that really considered work on the Sabbath in the original law of God, or was it just something that the Pharisees added because we know they added a lot of stuff?
Yep.
And so I'm giving her some scriptures where, in Exodus 34, let me see what I wrote here now. Exodus 34:21, it was against the original, I'm using the term original, law, to gather or harvest. It says no harvesting can be done. So that's what he was doing. Now, picking a few grain, a few ears of corn to eat, just munch it. Is that like harvesting your entire crop? Probably not, but it still was prohibited that they were not supposed to be doing it.
Right. And it seems that people sometimes try to make excuses for Jesus and the disciples and say
Exactly.
he wasn't breaking Sabbath.
Exactly.
But
That's
he
my
himself,
point.
Yes. The two examples he gives there in Matthew 12, he says the priests, he gives the examples of the priests, and he says they did something which was not lawful for him to eat. And then the next verse 5, and the priests break the Sabbath and are innocent. So he's giving examples of people who break the law,
But he's
and yet are innocent. So he is saying, I break
Yes,
the law.
yes.
But
And
apart,
my disciples
but
break
apart from that, the disciples are no priests. So he's even going beyond that. He's
I
making
can
them
see how they would
priests.
be super confused, because he's like, okay, so I'm telling you that I can break the law, but they're
Yeah.
like, well, can we?
Exactly.
You know, because they didn't even know, at this point, did they even know he was going to die? Is this
No.
what was going on?
No.
It's
I
interesting.
can see how they'll be super
Well, I think
confused.
that people, even that aren't Sabbath keepers, think that he didn't break the Sabbath, which is what she's saying on there too, not that she would.
But the point Sarah made just now, though, is the big one about the Sabbath. They are always trying. We're trying to, when it comes to the Sabbath, make Jesus not break the Sabbath. When it comes to fasting, not make Jesus say, "Don't fast at all." And other things. Barbara, you wanted to say something?
But in that quotation that Sarah just read, it is said, if need demands, you can ignore the Torah. Well, yes, need does demand because Jesus.
Right. I think the striking thing to me with the Numbers 15 story, look at that story. And we can talk about, well, if you're hungry, well, if the thing is if you're imminent danger or life-threatening, can you break well, in Numbers 15, not in comparison to God saying, on this day, like Michelle was saying, you better have everything worked out, because God said on this day, zilch. Okay? Either harvesting, either gathering wood for fire. But God is clear there, and that should dictate danger that Jesus had to heal him. Was anyone in imminent life danger of the people Jesus healed? No.
Or the people picking the grain to eat, they were going to die.
Were they?
If they didn't eat that.
Well, he raised up the dead, you mean? Is that?
Well,
The word dying, we're sick.
They were dying?
That was a little more
He
imminent.
killed them, yeah.
That was probably a little more imminent. Although if they died, he could have still raised them from the dead.
But his point was to prove that he is Lord of the Sabbath.
He can do whatever he wants.
And the old law, I think, demanded total, which that aspect of it, I think under the new law, people are so lax that it's like, oh, well, Jesus opened it up a free-for-all, because we're not dying the minute we sin.
Well, when
or
Jesus...
whatnot. And
When Jesus says in Matthew 12, isn't your life worth more than this law? And he's talking about a God-given law. And he's saying your life overrides it.
But I'm just going to add to this confusion.
Confusion?
When
Are we confused?
I'm trying to get this clear in my mind. I'm talking about a friend of mine. And God can use people to ask you the right question. Sabbath keeper is supposed to labor 6 days a week. That's part of it. Also, it's a law, correct? If you got a law, you have a penalty. Time to stone somebody to death. And I said, you know what? I haven't stoned anybody to death recently. My eyes are open. That's a good one to ask a Sabbath keeper. You're going to keep the Sabbath.
Right.
It's like teaching this tithing. You're going to teach one time, you got to teach at least 2, possibly 3.
Yeah.
That's the way you got to be honest if you want to do it.
Right. It's
So when people come to you about the tithing thing, just ask them, do you teach all of it? Oh, yeah. You teach the second time? Yeah.
Right.
How about a third time? Perhaps. I'm not so sure the third, but there's 2 for sure.
You know, it's interesting. It's interesting with the tithing ball. There's a story about tithing with Jesus, right? He says, you have done all the tithes,
Yeah.
but you have not done one thing. What was it?
You got to go, well, you
Show-
can't sell that stuff, give it to the poor.
No, show mercy.
Mercy, yeah, mercy.
He says, you've done all the tithes,
Yeah.
but you people are merciless. Again, you see how the mercy of Jesus, again, but it's Jesus, it's the Messiah, it's the new Moses. So if I accept Jesus as the one sent by God, I'm not going to try and justify him not breaking certain laws of the old covenant. So we'll wrap up because some of us, I think, need to leave early. So we'll pray, and can Tracy pray and close with prayer and for the food as well, so we can. And thanks everyone out there. Sorry about the internet.
Is there anything more to say for
No.
that?
I mean, I'm answering you.
Father in heaven, we just thank you for this day. We thank you that we can come together and fellowship and enjoy one another and encourage and strengthen one another and be as iron sharpening iron. Thank you, Father, that we have people here in this room and online that are true Bereans, willing to listen and be taught, but to search to see if it's found in the Scriptures. I ask that you would be with us all this week, that we would honor and glorify you through obedience